Welcome to the GEC Podcast, a ministry of Grace Episcopal Church, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. For more information and a schedule of our services, please visit gracesheboygan.com.
Hello, I'm Deacon Michelle Whitford. I am here talking with Carol Amadio, who is a hermit who has a solitary vocation. Carol, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, well, I'm Carol Amadio. I live on Washington Island in Wisconsin, and I have lived as a hermit since 2008.
And how did that come about? How did you know you were called to be a hermit? Are you called to be a hermit?
It's a fairly long story. I actually, as a young child, was really interested in prayer, and I wanted to know more about it, and I tried various ways to find out. And I'm 70 years old, so this was like over, 60 years ago or 50 years ago at least. And so I've had a very difficult time finding out about prayer. I mean, I knew there was the prayer book. I've been an Episcopalian all my life, but I knew there was more, but I couldn't really get anyone to tell me more about it. It's not like today where we have all kinds of books on spirituality and history and all that. We didn't. So I was I knew what my experience of God was, but I didn't know how to pray in a deeper way, if I guess I could say. And so just to make a long story short, eventually when I was about 16, we had something in Denver where I grew up called the Episcopal Lutheran Bookstore. And the head of that bookstore was a man who was a Lutheran, and he was very kind. He let the young people in our youth group come into his store and find books on things that we wanted to know about, and we could just sit and read all afternoon if we wanted to. And he would ask us what we wanted to know about. So I told him that I wanted to know more about prayer. And he said, well, he would look for books for me about that. And so one day I came in, and he said to me, there's a new book coming out on prayer, and I'm going to order it and keep it for you. And it was a pretty expensive book. And I said, well, I could use my babysitting money, I remember, to buy it. And he said, well, I'll give it to you and you can pay me. So he gave me Thomas Merton's Nooses of Contemplation. And I can remember reading that book and just being totally fascinated and knowing that I'd finally found a path that I wanted to walk, or that I knew was there, or something, however you say it. I can just remember even reading the first paragraph of that book and being really happy to be there. Well, Thomas Merton and I kind of grew up together. He was still in the monastery. This was like in the early 60s, and he didn't die until 1968. So for several years, I read his journals that came out at that time. They didn't all, of course, come out till after he was dead. But he talked about feeling a religious vocation to become what he called a hermit. He was a Benedictine monk, and he lived in community, but he felt to a deeper call to vocation. And I felt a call to priesthood, which eventually, that's a whole nother story, but I also felt called to a deeper level of prayer, and I think I always felt that. And so there came a time where, as I read his experience growing towards being a hermit, which he was allowed to do the last 2 or 3 years of his life, I began to think maybe I would be called to do that, not right away, but someday. So that kind of went on the back burner, and I continued to read and study and do all the things that one does as a younger person, but that thought never went away. And so there even came a time when I tried my vocation in a religious order for a short period of time, and I had a clear message that I would do this, something like this, but not now and not like this exactly. So that was when I was about 21, I guess, and I put that aside and actually got married and went on to do a number of things. And this sense of being called to a deeper level of prayer and eventually something else continued. And after I was ordained to the priesthood, we used to have clergy retreats regularly, and Bishop Griswold was my bishop at that point. And one of the things he did one year is to invite an 80-year-old Roman Catholic hermit to be at our retreat as a resource person. And to me, it was like the most incredible thing. I can remember being incredibly excited, but wondering if she would think I was really crazy because I had had this thought for so long. And so I went to her the very first night of retreat and asked if I could talk to her, and she allowed me to, and I explained a little about my journey, and I just said I wondered if she thought that could be real and if she'd be willing to talk to me about it. And she was just really kind. Her name was Sister Maud, and she said she thought that was pretty much the way a lot of people were called to be hermits, and that it probably wouldn't happen for quite a few years in my life, but she thought it sounded like it had reality to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the next 2 or 3 days of retreat. She laughed and said, "I don't think I'm going to have too much business here," and so that was true. I mean, a few people came to see her, but for the most part, she had a nice open schedule. So I went to see her several times, and we had a long conversation about all the practical realities of being a hermit, as well as the spiritual issues that were involved in that vocation and some of the things in her life that had drawn her to that. And, she was a Roman Catholic sister, so she'd already lived within community when she began to live as a hermit. So we talked about everything from, what you ate and how you shopped and where you lived. And I can remember the best advice she gave me is she said, it may be all very romantic to chop wood and carry water when you're in your 20s and 30s, but when you get to be a hermit, you'll probably be in your 60s and 70s, and you need to find a place where you can have solitude and where you can be quiet and alone, but you also need to have a place where you have some kind of community and where you can find groceries and heat and medical care, because, if you live in such a remote place where you don't have those things, it'll be difficult for you to live that kind of a life, especially as you get older. So I took that to heart and, again, put away the notion of vocation more or less, although I continued to explore and follow Thomas Merton and other hermits I read about, and I read a lot about the desert fathers and mothers and tried to understand more about the history of people who've been hermits, and went back to kind of my normal life. And then in 2008, I was 64, and I suddenly began to have a very strong sense that now was the time. And so I was by then living on Washington Island. I had, over the years, Ansel, my husband, and I had thought about possibly doing this kind of a vocation together. Unfortunately, by then he had dementia and Parkinson's disease and was not able to do some of the things we would have needed to do that. But I was taking care of him, and eventually at that point he needed more care and so forth. I mean, that's another chapter of this saga. But anyway, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to be able to do this kind of a vocation. The Episcopal Church is not opposed to hermits, but we have no canon on hermits, as the Roman Catholic Church does. There are hermits around, and it's easy to get their blogs. And in fact, as I was getting into this more, I found a book on the modern hermit, written in 2007, which was very helpful in the practical and canonical issues of being a hermit. So I just began to think about it and pray about it, and then a deacon in our diocese here in Fond du Lac came to me and asked if I'd be willing to work with him in spiritual direction, and I said indeed I would, but I would ask if he would be willing to help me with this vocation. That was not, I think, a part of his repertoire exactly, but he was very kind and willing to. And so over the next several months, over a year, he and I worked together to look at all kinds of various issues. And I looked at the issue of formation. I taught both in the deacon school and in seminary as well as at Loyola University, so I knew something about taking a person and helping them find formation within a vocational system. And so I tried to look at that, and I spent a lot of time doing courses online with Sister Joan Chittister, who's a Benedictine, Father Thomas Keating, who's a Benedictine, and some of the lectures and things from Thomas Merton that are now available online. Quite a few of them are. as well as praying and working in spiritual direction and continuing my rule of life and so on and so forth. So when that finally, we got to a point in 2009, I'd actually gone to Credo, which is a really great program, and one of the things you do in Credo is to talk with a group of clergy your own age and life situation about what's going on in your life and what you're thinking of doing next. And I was the only person in my group that was thinking about being a hermit, but I must say the group was supportive and helpful, and the faculty of that Credo were helpful to me also. And I felt after I went through that experience that I was ready to take a first set of temporary vows. So I went to my priest, who was the closest priest to me. I'm close to Sister Bay, and the priest there is in essence my rector, although other than supply worker when I go across the island, I'm not there. I did spend some time living there when Anselm was sick, but for the most part I don't see her that much. But I asked her if she would be willing to receive my temporary vows, and she agreed to do that. And so she and Dutton Morehouse, who's the deacon that I was working with, and I met in the chapel, and I made temporary vows for 6 months, and I had written ahead of time a rule of life that I thought would be suitable for that period of my life, and so I proceeded to live out that 6-month period. I actually, my husband was quite ill at that point, and he died in between, and so I continued to live the rule, but I felt that it wasn't appropriate to take any more vows until I had dealt with the grief issues that I had and was sure that I could freely make a decision about what I was going to do vocationally. So it was 2.5 years later, and I continued to work in spiritual direction and live the rule and so forth. And I decided that I needed to make a determination about several things. One of them, should I take another set of temporary vows? Secondly, where was my main community? Because hermits also have communities, even though we live alone. One of the issues that we have is how do we live within a community, and how are we accountable within a community? And on Washington Island, we have no Episcopal church. We have a Lutheran church, and for many years, I have been an associate member of that parish, so my spiritual community was that parish. My main community, as far as I was concerned, was the island. Since I've been ordained a priest, a lot of my vocation has involved caring for people that were not involved in the church. They claimed to be atheists, or they claimed to not ever have been in church, or they claimed that the church did something to them if they don't want to be in the church or whatever. And I, on the island for a number of years, have worked with people like that, as well as when I was in Chicago, I did quite a bit of that. So I felt that one focus of my vocation would probably be to continue to be available to people in that circumstance, and also, of course, to be involved in my parish community. But I also felt I needed some additional support from women, so I had 5 women that were various religious traditions: 1 Lutheran, 1 Episcopalian, 1 Free Church person, 1 Methodist. I can't remember what the 5th one's religious tradition is, but I asked them if they would help me explore this vocation further as I was preparing to take some more vows. And they knew me well. They didn't know much about hermits or any of that, but they were very helpful to me, and I spent time with them and discussed this with them, as well as continuing in spiritual direction and the formation program. And then the other thing I needed to decide was what kind of rule would I have. I mean, hermits can take a variety. There are Carmelites that are hermits, there are Franciscans, there are Benedictines, and some hermits have their own rule. They make, they kind of cobble together a rule. I decided that was not, for a huge variety of reasons, what I needed to do. The Episcopal Church, as far as I could tell, didn't have any particular guidance on the subject. And I finally just decided that, given the fact that the rule of St. Benedict was good enough for Joan Chittister, Thomas Burton, and Thomas Keating, it was good enough for me. So I began to study the rule of St. Benedict, and I felt that it really did for me what I needed to do. And, I think all of our Christian journey or all our spiritual journeys is a combination of having structure and then also being free to exercise a unique vocation, if that's what we're being called to do.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it was important to have structure in my life and in my day, and a rule of life that was, in essence, time-tested and that was compatible with how I saw my prayer life and my other vocational commitments. And so I began to study the rule as deliberately as I could, both old versions of it, new versions of it. There's lots of really good material on the internet today and all kinds of things with this. So I approached my pastor and I explained this whole thing to him and asked him if he would be willing to receive a second set of temporary vows, and then if we did that, if he'd be willing to work with me until he felt I was ready to make permanent vows, or I was feeling that wasn't what I was called to do, and he agreed to it. And I made some snide comment about, well, I guess Lutherans aren't very into hermits and benedictions, and he said, oh, there are Benedictine Lutherans, so I learned something new right away. So, again, that was a small group this time. There were 5 of us who met at Trinity Lutheran Church. It was a private situation, and I made a new set of vows. I wrote them based on some of the things in the prayer book around making commitments of various kinds for Christian service, and went ahead and did that. And so then our pastor, his name was Frank, and I met 3 or 4 times for a rather extensive conversation around what I was doing in my formation process and what was going on in my spiritual life and so forth. It was kind of spiritual. I mean, it was spiritual direction of a kind, but a specialized kind. And at the end of, I made my temporary vows in June of 2000. 2013. I'm trying to figure out where it was. I've been in. Well, I don't know. Anyway, it was like maybe 2011, and around April of 2012, I believe it was, he said to me, I think it's time you got on with it. You've been thinking about this for over 50 years. Maybe it's time we just got this done. And I said, well, are you saying you think I'm ready to make permanent vows or, life vows? And he said, well, I don't know what else you need to do to do anything else. And I had to pretty much agree with him. So then I spent several months studying the way Benedictines take life vows, but I also tried to look at practical realities now. But I wasn't interested in going back to the 6th century and trying to live that life in that way. And so he asked me to do that, actually, and it's kind of my assignment. So I wrote a liturgy and I wrote a vow service, and it was incorporated in the Eucharist. And I talked to a number of people that I asked to be there with me. All the people that had been involved up until then were invited. And then I think there were, one of the things you do when you make life vows is you're supposed to make public vows, but that has to be defined. So we talked about originally, well, maybe I should just do this before the whole congregation. And I felt like I needed to be working on the commitment I was making and worrying about what our congregation, which really consisted like about 19 faith communities, I just thought it'd be very confusing to some people, and that I needed to have people there that I felt were committed to their own spiritual situation and that would be able to understand what I was doing and not think it was weird or upsetting. So we have a little staged church on Washington Island that was built by the community, and it's part of the ministry of Trinity Lutheran Church. It's a beautiful little all-wooden building, and so we scheduled the vow service for one evening, and 19 people came, and I made my vows. Frank witnessed them, and Sutton and Barbara also did, and then we had a little reception, and that was it. So I began living the full. Well, I was actually living the life for several years, probably 5, before I finally made those final vows, and sort of assumed that I would be just living on the island. Benedictines take 3 vows: obedience, stability, and conversion of life. And so obedience was not a big step, since as a deacon and a priest, I took those vows already. So that's sort of the same thing. You listen to the people that are in charge of your life and your work, and you try to hear what God's saying and other people. And I was trying to do that as I was consulting these various people that were helping me or reading or whatever. And then stability means you basically, I mean, you can interpret that in many ways, but the way I interpreted it is that I had been called to be on the island, caring for the people of that island in whatever way I could through various things that I was involved in. One of the things that's a part of my rule, and probably the rule of all solitaries, is service, that you work with people. And in my case, I'm a social worker, and I work with our public health nurse. I've been a hospice volunteer and worked with grief groups and caregiver groups and those kinds of things. I work in our food pantry. I try to do low-key kinds of things where I'm able to help people with various issues and use some of the skills that I already have. Hermits, a lot of times people have all kinds of silly stereotypes, thinking of, if you're a hermit, you're a recluse, which you do spend a lot of time alone or with God, by yourself, whatever. As a solitary person, you spend a lot of time in silence, but you're definitely not a recluse. And hermits, even Anthony of the Desert, who was one of the first well-known hermits, got out of his desert cave and went up and helped one of the church councils to straighten out the Arian heresy, and then went back and did his hermit thing. So hermits, hermits feel they belong to the church. They're usually not as connected necessarily to a bishop or something as we are when we're ordained, but they're still part of the community. They're accountable to the community, and if the church needs them, they try to go and do what they're asked to do. I guess my thought was that I would probably always, for the rest of my life, live on Washington Island, caring for the people of that island. And as a matter of fact, a year or so after my final vows, our pastor retired, and I was asked to join an interim team to take care of the interim process for the Lutheran Church until we called a new pastor. And I prayed about that and talked about that with people and decided it was not inconsistent with my vocation as a hermit. So proceeded to be a part of that interim team and did that. And after I did that, I tried to leave for a while so the new pastor would be able to get his bearings as a pastor without having those of us who are interims around. It's unusual for interims to stay in a parish after a new pastor comes. So I went off and did a 30-day retreat with the Jesuits, that some of whom I knew in Massachusetts, and tried to explore what next steps would be, and assumed those next steps would be to go home and work down the island doing what I was doing. That seemed like I was doing compatible things, and wasn't here long when last clergy retreat, a couple of my clergy buddies decided that it would be a good idea for me to explore doing some interim ministry here in the diocese, which I sort of resisted that at first, feeling it was not appropriate to the whole vow stability and all of that sort of thing. But again, to make a long story short, I finally decided that it was something that was compatible with my vocation, and that I could continue to live my life as a hermit and be an interim. And so I am now in the second interim in the diocese, and assume that after this is over, I will return to Washington Island and resume my life, live the way I do as a hermit. So that's kind of a quick overview. I don't know if you have other questions you want to ask me.
So as an interim, I guess the question is, as a solitary person, how do you make money? How do you have funds to live with?
Well, that's an important question for anybody who's going to be a hermit, but that's also why most people aren't hermits until they're retired, because in my case, of course, I worked for many years and I have Social Security and some pensions, and hermits, at least Benedictine hermits, and I don't think most hermits, can take vows of poverty. I took a vow of simplicity, which means that I try to live simply within the means I have, but I, do all the things that are suggested in this book on modern hermits, which is kind of interesting, and where a lot of Roman Catholic bishops have been really concerned about having people in their diocese become hermits because they were afraid maybe they'd become a drag on the diocese in terms of financial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in order to be a canonical hermit in the Roman Catholic Church, they have all kinds of things they have to do in terms of having all kinds of insurance and planning their burial and funeral and assuring the bishop that they had enough to live on, and could live comfortably and not become a financial burden on either the diocese or the state.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found it interesting. These were pretty practical things, but I actually went ahead and did all of them. I had paid for my burial and funeral and had that all planned and ready. My funeral plans are in the hands of my pastor and the bishop, I think, or if they aren't, they will be eventually. And I got insurance of various kind, including on the island, even helicopter insurance, which allows if I would need to be airlifted off because I'd been injured, that I could have that done, medical insurance, long-term care insurance, various kinds of things, so that I really did. I could live a simple life. I mean, I think the basics are covered that way, so I don't have to worry about amassing a big fortune so that in case something happens, I'll have the money.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't in any way consider that I've taken a vow of poverty. Hermits also, Benedictines usually take a vow of celibacy, but that's implied. It isn't direct, but I believe I also did that. But, you can choose not to. I mean, some hermits today are married. Some hermits don't take life vows. They only take year-to-year vows, and they never take life vows. But I just thought that I was discerning that I was doing what I was meant to do. So the interesting thing about all of this is that it's that there's a lot of variation, although there's a huge amount of tradition as well. And I guess one of the things that I think about this whole thing, there are lots of hermits all over the world. Many of them do live on places like islands, but there are also people that live right in the middle of the city. And I really don't think that it's necessary to be in an isolated geographical space to be a hermit. It's just, in my situation, I felt that was what I was called to do, but it's done in different ways. And one of the issues is, I think, as monastic communities in the old way, the way we're used to, or at least that I was used to as a young person, begin to diminish and, no longer be in existence, at least in the way we thought of them, but it does seem like more people are being called to this solitary life, and that one of the things we're called to do is not only work within the church, but to work outside of the church. So I sort of ask myself, is being a hermit like the elemental particle of the religious life?
Yeah.
And I know in our diocese we seem to have a number of clergy that are becoming oblates in religious orders, Roman Catholic and or Anglican, who are taking their idea of having a rule of life really seriously, getting into spiritual direction. I mean, I think there's all kinds of things that are coming up in our world, not just in the Episcopal Anglican setting, but in Roman Catholics and Lutherans and a lot of other people that I know of, both clergy and lay people, that are wanting to take their spiritual journeys more seriously and in a more deliberate way, and in a way that really makes them accountable to one or more communities. And one of the things I do is I actually am canonically resident in Chicago. I would not mind being canonically resident in Fond du Lac, but it's not possible because of financial issues that have to do with retirement. So I will always, I guess, be a member of the Diocese of Chicago. So I thought about what I could do to be at least supportive of that community. And one of the things that I've done is to ask my bishop there to appoint me to be a help to a Christian community, a parish, and it was actually one that I was in before. And the priest there, when I first began this, was new in the parish, and she felt it would be helpful to her to have me around to talk to and to be there. And I go once a year and I preach and I do whatever she asks me to do.
Yeah.
Last year it was bless pets and help with the junior high kids, and it depends on what she wants me to do. But it gives me, I pray for them regularly. They know that. I'm available if people want to come up on vacation and spend time with me. They can. I haven't had that so far. She comes and stays with me sometimes. And since I've been in interim, it's been sort of more mutual ministry, because we talk about preaching and sermons and issues that come up in parish ministry. And
Sure.
it's given me a whole new appreciation for what it is to run a parish, I must say, too. I haven't done it for maybe 12 years. And I'd never done it full time until now. So this was like, it's been really interesting for me. But I think, and I don't kid myself that I'm a big impact on this particular parish in Chicago, but I have some involvement with them. I'm available if they need me, and it's very helpful to me. I was just looking on Facebook. They just had a meeting with the youth, and they had 90 kids show up to talk about what it meant to be a Christian. I was very proud. I feel like, I'm at least at some level a part of that parish, and I really care about what's going on with them and the ministry there, and I try to support that ministry through prayer, which basically is a hermit's main job, is prayer. I mean, it's boiled down to all the other activities we may be getting into, but our main job is prayer.
So you said something a little bit earlier, which it was surprising to me, that I think of solitaries or hermits as someone who lives in a geographic area that is remote. But you said they could be in the middle of the city, and that sparked my imagination about people who do live in the middle of the city and are completely alone. And I hadn't put those two things together, so that was very interesting to me, the whole thought of living a solitary life in the middle of people.
Well, and the book that I'm referring to it talks about that there are quite a lot of people that are living solitary lives in the middle of the city. And of course, Taizé, the order of Taizé, they have people that live. Taizé, of course, is an order that is Cenobitic. I mean, they live together as community, but a lot of them come in twos or threes and live in the midst of the city. A lot of other religious communities are placing some of their members in cities to live, within apartments or whatever, to be, again, sort of maybe some kind of a leaven in the midst of the city. So that's, and, I lived in Chicago, and I was a lawyer, and my main issues as a teacher, lawyer, and priest were to try to understand how I could live a contemplative part of my vocation as essentially an active person. I mean, my days were very full of all kinds of teaching and preaching and trying cases and working in administration and writing and all that. And so my biggest question was, how can I be a faithful person of prayer in the midst of that? And, I answered that some by having a spiritual director and using the sacraments regularly and, going on retreats for things we all think about. Now, at least until I ended up as an interim, one of the questions I had regularly was, how can I live the active part of my vocation authentically as a hermit, whose basic job now is more to be a person of prayer. I have my rule has me staying 4 offices, doing centering prayer, doing spiritual reading, Lectio Divina, standard kinds of things one does as a religious, someone living within a religious setting. But to me, just like when I was in the active ministry in Chicago, I couldn't have survived without having the contemplative, quiet side of things for myself. It flipped the other way when I became a hermit, and I realized it was at least for me, I wouldn't have been authentic unless I had some active work that I did. And, and I'm not always sure what that is, but God so far has managed to make sure that I have plenty of that. But, it's always a balance. I mean, the spiritual journey, I think, for all of us is always a balance between active and contemplation and structure and spontaneity and, obedience and, thinking for oneself and going beyond the box or whatever. So I find it actually pretty interesting and exciting. I've been happy to live this way and look forward to seeing how it goes. I mean, certainly I'm at my age, it's possible that before long, or maybe quite a while from now, I'll end up in a nursing home or in a facility where I need care. And if so, I mean, one of the things that's good about the vocation as a hermit is there's always things you can do. If nothing else, you can spend your day in prayer, or you can spend your day working with people that are ill. And I know my husband, he was a priest also, and when he was in the nursing home for about 2 years, he came and his ability to know where he was came and went. But the last thing he did before he died was to care for a person in that community that was dying, and he sat with her and was with her until she died. So if nothing else, I see the vocation as a hermit as something that is a good way to move into the next step after retirement, which of course for all of us is eventually death. We don't know when that's coming, and my family tends to have really long-lived women, so for me it could be quite a while, but it could not be also. So, and I think those are issues that we think about when we're retired and when we're priests for our whole lives, but yet, we're not, we have to be careful that we're not interfering with whoever is in charge of the community that we're a part of. So our vocation has to change. And so one of the gifts that I have naturally built into my life as a hermit is those things. I'm able to do those things. I mean, I don't usually see my job or my vocation as running things or being on boards or telling people what to do, as I did in my earlier life, that I'm there to try to be available, open to what I can do to be helpful, support younger people as they're learning leadership roles. It would just depend. I mean, when I'm in the congregation that I'm in, I do a lot of the same things everybody would do in our congregation, be a communion minister and sing in the choir and be a cantor and whatever. But if the pastor asks me to, I teach classes, and when he's gone, I, take services. Or I've been the interim 3 times before I actually did a whole interim for that congregation since I've been on the island, and so it's kind of cool because you use whatever gifts and skills you have, whatever experiences you have. And as I get older, I have to add commensurate with your ability physically to do some of those things. I mean, even now as an interim, I'm aware that I'm not, for example, I can no longer kneel, and I can't stand up for really long periods of time. So I have to modify how I minister. And I at first felt that was like really frustrating, but then I actually realized that I have a lot of people in my congregation that are meeting those same challenges, and that for me to help work those out myself and to let them know what I'm doing, which I do, may be helpful to them. So, I mean, I think being a hermit is like a very basic part, just being a very basic person, living a very basic life within the Christian community. And if you happen to be a priest, it's really kind of wonderful to be able to exercise priestly ministry from time to time and to be in the communities we have, like, when we go on retreats and have clergy days and all that. I find that really supportive of being a hermit as well as being a priest, but it's not necessary to be ordained in order to be a hermit or to live that life. And I have actually met a few hermits. They've all been men now, but that's pretty much what they do. I mean, none of them are ordained. They live the kind of life I live without the ordination issues. So
That's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the history of hermits? You alluded to the Desert Fathers and to the 6th century. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about and that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, I'll do my best. I'm sure by now, especially if we're in this diocese, Bishop Gunter talks about the Desert Fathers and Mothers all the time. Some people don't really realize there were Desert Mothers as well as Desert Fathers.
Yes.
These were people who left Egypt or other big cities and came into the desert for a whole lot of reasons, I'm sure. And I think all of this vocation is something that's very complicated and has to do with our own circumstances. But for the most part, they came to the desert to learn to be closer to God. Mm-hmm. And that started, they think, probably around the 3rd century. I think I'm right. I mean, I didn't study all this right away before I talked to you, but that's pretty accurate, is that there were large numbers of people who did this, and some people stayed for brief periods of time and then went off and did something else, and others stayed their whole lives. And, of course, both men and women began to be able to be what we might call now spiritual directors. Mm-hmm. And they also were confessors, although most of them weren't ordained. That's really where the term father, and, if we use that as a term for a woman who's ordained, mother came from. It really wasn't from ordination. It was from the relationship one has as a spiritual father or mother to the persons that are also learning to live that life, but also for people that come to these people for care and religious guidance and instruction. So that went on, and St. Benedict in the 6th century began his ministry as a hermit, and he lived a desert life and did the same kinds of things, giving guidance, and he began to be well known and was then asked by a group of monastics, monks, to come and be their abbot. And he didn't really think he should do that, but he decided that was what God was calling him to do. So we went off, and he felt that they needed a rule, which that became the reason, I guess, that he wrote the rule. And it wasn't a totally original rule. It came from a lot of rules that had been done before John Cashin and a number of other people that had written rules for people to live by as monastics. And he tried to help the people that he lived with, the men he lived with, live that rule and abide by it. Well, they weren't really grateful. They tried to poison him eventually because they thought he was way too strict. And so he went back to the desert for a while, and then eventually was called again, and then he began to establish a number of communities. And of course, the rule of St. Benedict is the basis for a great many religious orders and rules, even the ones that aren't considered necessarily Benedictine. Mm-hmm. So, and there's always been hermits. I mean, at least people, they may not be called that, but they, there've always been people that have lived solitary lives under some sort of a rule, and usually under the guidance of a wise man or woman. Mm-hmm. And they, the main way a person became a hermit in the early days was to work with a spiritual father or mother and regularly live with them and watch what they did and pray with them and learn to be honest about their thoughts, kind of what we do in spiritual direction. People come to me and say, well, what do you do in spiritual direction? And you could use the technical thing, well, you make a manifestation of conscience. Well, that would scare the heck out of most people. So what I always say is, when you're here, you come and you try to tell me what's really going on. Yeah. And we try to talk about that. Yeah. And when I have a new spiritual director since I've been here, and when I met with her the first time, that's pretty much what I said to her, is that I understood spiritual direction to be an honest relationship where it was my responsibility to come and let her know what's really going on in my life and what I'm struggling with, not just what we would consider spiritually, but all the way across the board. Mm-hmm. And so that's really how, I love actually reading works from the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Sister Joan Chittister just put out a really little gem of sayings, and Thomas Merton has them, and there's lots of them all over the place, but they're just really pithy statements that just say very simply and directly what it means to live a Christian life. And they're pretty universal, I think, in terms of, obviously, we don't live the same way they lived in the 3rd century, but a lot of the advice is very similar to what we'd probably say to people that when we were preaching or doing spiritual direction or during a confession or whatever. I mean, it's just a kind of a wonderful, to me, a wonderful history and a wonderful connection between where we are now and what went on there. And that's kind of what we do as hermits too. I mean, most of the people, I do have a couple of people that are coming to see me for spiritual direction, and that's what we know, and we talk about that. But most of the people I see and work with, we don't call it anything. It's just they come and see me because they want to talk about something.
Yeah.
And, and I have never had this happen. I mean, if I had somebody who was coming to see me to talk about silly things or nothing, I probably would say, well, maybe we should do something different. But
right.
Most people, I mean, one of the interesting things that you see when you do research is that they say that most people, if you ask them, do you have a person you can come to and talk about the things that are really important in your life, can you think of anyone like that? And a lot of people have to say no. And so I think one of the things that we all do with clergy, but hermits sometimes, because we kind of live below the clerical radar most of the time,
mm-hmm.
are there for people who wouldn't even think of approaching a clergy person.
Sure.
Sure. So I see that as also part of the vocation of hermits today, is that we're just there for whatever people need. That is a better grammatical thing. And I know, this is the first time I've ever done an interview about being a hermit. I've been asked to do it with our newspaper and a lot of other things, and I don't, because I don't feel that it's appropriate for me to kind of get up on a soapbox and say, here I am a hermit, and mm-hmm. This is what we do. Partly because a lot of people wouldn't even understand the concept of vocation, and it's not what we do. But on the other hand, this kind of an interview, which I assume is directed to help people discern their own vocations and look at their own spiritual journeys, I think is okay. But for the most part, I mean, it's hard to even know how many hermits there are or where they are or anything, because we pretty much don't identify ourselves publicly. I mean, I let my bishops know, certainly, that this is what I was considering before I made my vows, because as an ordained person, I mean, you don't really make any major decision in your life without at least informing your bishop. But for the most part, other than that, I didn't tell anybody about it at all until after I made my final vows. And I know the first time I even talked about it in a group was when Bishop Lee said to me, well, now that you've done this, I think you should let your brothers and sisters know that this is what you're doing. And I can remember still going, ew, I'm not sure I want to do that. But I did. She said to do it. And it was fine. And then eventually I realized that even on Washington Island, where I am, even with my friends that aren't involved in church, that it was important that they understand this about me, because on the island, if you don't tell people what you're really doing, they actually make stuff up. So if I have friends or if people ask me, I'm more than happy to answer whatever it is they want to know, and I try to do it in a way that'll be helpful to them where they are. But I don't, go in for interviews or write books or mm-hmm. give lectures on my life as a hermit on the island. I mean, that's just not how it works. I mean, I pretty much try to be low-key and just act like a regular, normal person. And as I say, I don't hide it, but I don't announce it. And I mean, Bishop Gunter, a couple of, I guess at the last clergy day, suddenly announced it to everyone, and I can still remember sort of feeling like, ew. And then I thought, well, I mean, these are my brothers and sisters here, mm-hmm. so this was a lot simpler than what I had to do in Chicago, because I had to talk to a huge number of people there and kind of spread the word. And this way, he just did it all at once, and I didn't really have to think about it. But right. I think that's an issue also, is, who needs to know and why, if I'm going to talk about something like this, like, why am I doing that?
Right.
I mean, what's my motivation for going around talking about this?
Mm-hmm.
It's really, it's not an essential part of a vocation as it would be, if you're a lawyer and you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to have to hang out your shingle. Well, hermits, at least as far as I know, don't hang out their shingle.
Right. Well, this has been incredibly helpful to me to understand another whole aspect of how we can be in Christ, how we can live out being part of the body, that part of the body is quiet and contemplative and lives a solitary life. It's fascinating to me, especially because I live kind of in the where everybody's all out and talking about it all the time. Being the parish administrator here, I live and breathe it all the time, and to be quiet is a gift that I don't get very often.
You see the giftedness in it, which is part of the gift, is to recognize that silence is a gift that we're given.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. Thank you very much for...
Well, you're welcome. I hope it helps. And, if there's clarifications or anything I can do to help you as you edit it or whatever, please let me know. I'd be glad to do that. But
okay.
I also think it shows that God has an incredible ability to use all kinds of situations and all kinds of ways to bring the sense of God into people's lives,
mm-hmm.
even people that don't think they want to have any part in or don't even see God as real. But
mm-hmm.
it's just kind of interesting. And I mean, there's some fun books. The first book I ever read that kind of made me feel that there was something going on was in the 80s. One of my students, who happened to, again, be a sister at Loyola University, I talked about something in class that must have brought this up, and she brought me a book by Martha Sinatar, who's written a lot of books on sort of self-help books, called Ordinary People as Monks and Mystics. And she did a whole research project where she tried to get people to talk, in writing and in questionnaire about their lives, and discovered that even back then there were lots of people who were living what we might call a hermit life, out of the spotlight, and looked at why they'd done it and how old they were and so forth. And so that was really the first kind of hint I had that people actually did that in the, quote, secular world, not just in monastic communities. Because a lot of hermits live on the grounds of monastic communities and are people that have been monks and sisters in community, and then when they're older, they're allowed to live as hermits. And there are critiques that say that people that haven't done that don't, in essence, have any right to be hermits. But in my opinion, the Christian life as an active person also trains one in being a part of God's plan and living a spiritual journey, and that if you've lived a balanced life as an active person, that being a hermit is definitely not inconsistent. Plus, it's God who decides, not whoever writes those books.
Right.
But it's kind of interesting. It's like everything else, there's all kinds of controversy around this. And I know one of the things I did when I was considering this is I had been in psychotherapy for a long time when I was in Chicago, and I worked with a psychiatrist I respected a lot, and felt that I needed to at least check in with him to tell him what I was doing and asking if he thought I needed to do any other kind of work in that realm. And it was interesting to me because we did have to have some sessions, because he had all kinds of stereotypes about what it meant to be a hermit, and he was afraid that I was going to become like an asocial personality or something.
Right.
And I had to explain that that's far from the truth, that you actually end up more involved with people in a lot of ways, at least part of your life. And so that was interesting, but it's just, anytime you do anything different, you just realize there's lots of stereotypes out there.
Right.
Okay, well.
Thank you so much.
That's what you needed.
This has been wonderful, and I've enjoyed our chat. Thank you very much.
Well, me too. It's been fun to kind of try to put it together in one piece like this.
Sure.
So, well, you take care, and I assume I'll see you on the retreat.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Very
Won't be
good.
long.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For more information and a schedule of our services, please visit gracesheboygan.com.